Chapter 4: The Birth of the Postage Stamp, Reform of 1847. The year is 1847. The United States is growing, stretching its limbs toward the Pacific. But in the quiet, dusty corners of the nation's post offices, a different kind of revolution is taking place. It is a revolution not of guns or borders, but of gum and paper. It is the revolution of the postage stamp. To understand the magnitude of this moment, we must first step back into the chaotic, handwritten world that existed before July 1, 1847. We must visualize a world without stamps. For the first 70 years of the American postal system, the concept of prepayment was alien. When a person in 1840 wanted to send a letter, they did not buy a stamp. They did not weigh the envelope at home. They simply folded their paper, sealed it with wax, and walked to the post office. There, the postmaster would weigh it, check the distance to the destination in a large, worn book, and then write a number in the upper right-hand corner of the letter with a quill pen. Usually, this number represented the amount due. This was the era of recipient pays. It was a system built on a strange kind of faith. The sender assumed the recipient would want the letter enough to pay for it. The post office assumed the recipient had the money, but often these assumptions were wrong. Imagine the scene on a porch in rural Virginia. The post rider arrives. He hands a letter to a woman. He tells her the postage due is 25 cents, a significant sum, perhaps the cost of a day's food. The woman looks at the handwriting. She recognizes it. It is from a distant cousin she has not seen in years. She weighs the cost in her mind. Is the news inside worth 25 cents? No, she says. I refuse it. The writer takes the letter back. The post office has carried this piece of paper across 300 miles of mud and rain, paid the rider, fed the horse, and maintained the station, only to receive nothing in return. The letter is tossed into a dead letter sack, eventually to be burned or pulped. By the 1840s, this system was bleeding the post office dry. The corridors of the dead letter office in Washington, D.C. were overflowing with rejected correspondence. Tens of thousands of unpaid letters piled up like snowdrifts. The inefficiency was staggering. The clerks spent hours accounting for money that had not yet been collected, writing in ledgers that were filled with debts rather than credits. The solution lay across the ocean. In 1840, Great Britain had introduced the penny black, the world's first adhesive postage stamp, championed by the reformer Rowland Hill. It was a simple concept: make the sender pay. If the postage is paid up front, the delivery is guaranteed, and the post office gets its money regardless of whether the recipient is home or interested. In the United States, the shift was slower. It began with the Act of 1845, which simplified the rates. Instead of a complex sliding scale based on exact mileage, the rate was set simply: 5 cents for distances under 300 miles and 10 cents for distances over 300 miles. This simplification paved the way for the standardization of payment. Then came the Act of March 3, 1847. Congress officially authorized the Postmaster General, Cave Johnson, to prepare postage stamps. This brings us to the quiet, meticulous work of creation. The contract to print these first American stamps was not given to the government printing office, but to a private firm in New York City: Rawdon, Wright, Hatch, and Edson. These men were not mere printers, they were banknote engravers. They were masters of security, used to printing currency and stock certificates. They understood that a stamp was in essence a tiny piece of money. It had to be beautiful, and it had to be impossible to forge. Let us enter the engraving room of Rawdon, Wright, Hatch, and Edson in the spring of 1847. The room is filled with the smell of oil and metal shavings. The light comes from large north-facing windows, providing a consistent, diffuse illumination that does not cast harsh shadows. A master engraver sits at a workbench. In his hand, he holds a burin, a steel cutting tool with a diamond tip. He is working on a small square of soft steel, known as the die. He is not drawing with ink, he is carving into the metal. Every line he cuts will eventually hold ink. The pressure he applies determines the depth of the groove, which in turn determines the darkness of the line on the final stamp. He is working in reverse. To create a face that looks left, he must carve a face that looks right. The design process for the 1847 issue was conservative and reverent. There were to be two denominations, a 5-cent stamp and a 10-cent stamp. The subjects chosen were the two undisputed patriarchs of the nation, Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. Let us look closely with the eye of a jeweler at the 5-cent Franklin. The color chosen was a warm, earthy red-brown. Philatelists, stamp collectors, have spent over a century debating the exact shade, calling it everything from orange-brown to dark-brown to grayish-brown. But in 1847, it was simply the color of the ink they had mixed. The central image is a bust of Benjamin Franklin, based on a portrait by Jean-Baptiste Greuze. Why Franklin? Because he was the first Postmaster General. He was the patron saint of the service. In the stamp, Franklin looks to the left. He is balding, his hair long and loose in the back, evoking the image of the philosopher-statesman. He wears a simple coat and a cravat. The engraving is incredibly fine. If you look under a magnifying glass, you can see the individual lines of the hair, the shading on his cheek, the heavy-lidded expression of his eyes. Around Franklin's head is an oval frame. The background of the stamp is filled with engine-turned lathe work, intricate, repetitive geometric patterns that swirl and loop with mathematical precision. This was not just decoration, it was a security feature. A human hand could not easily replicate the perfect mechanical symmetry of the lathe work, making the stamp difficult to counterfeit. At the top of the stamp, in a serif font, curve the words US Post Office. At the bottom, in a straight line, 5 cents. In the corners, the initials U and S are nestled in the scroll work. This 5-cent stamp was the workhorse. It paid for a standard letter weighing half an ounce to travel up to 300 miles. This would get a letter from New York to Philadelphia or from Boston to Albany. Now let us turn to the 10-cent Washington. The contrast is immediate. While Franklin is rendered in warm brown, Washington is printed in a deep, authoritative black. The portrait is based on the famous painting by Gilbert Stuart, the same image that would eventually grace the $1 bill. Washington looks to the right, facing away from Franklin. He is dressed in formal attire, the high collar of his coat visible. His expression is stoic, calm, and commanding. The design elements mirror the Franklin stamp, but are slightly more ornate. The oval frame is heavier, the words US Post Office arc over his head, and 10 cents anchors the bottom. The numeral X, Roman numeral for 10, appears in the lower corners, while the letters U and S are in the top corners.
The black ink of the 10-cent stamp was dense. It had a viscosity, a thickness that gave the stamp a tactile quality. When the ink dried, you could almost feel the raised ridges of the lines with your fingertip. This is the hallmark of intaglio printing, line engraving. The paper is pressed into the ink-filled grooves of the steel plate under immense pressure, actually embossing the paper slightly. The production process was slow and rhythmic. The original steel die, carved by the master engraver, was hardened in a furnace. Then, a transfer roll of softer steel was rocked back and forth over the hard die, picking up the impression in relief. This transfer roll was then hardened and used to rock the image onto a large steel printing plate. The printing plate for the 1847 issue contained 200 images arranged in 2 panes of 100 stamps each. Imagine the printing floor. The pressman takes the plate, he warms it slightly. He slathers it with the thick oil-based ink, brown for Franklin, black for Washington. He then takes a cloth and wipes the surface of the plate clean. This is the crucial step. The ink must remain only in the carved grooves, not on the surface. If he wipes too much, the image will be faint. If he wipes too little, the stamp will be smudged. He places a sheet of damp paper over the plate. He turns the wheel of the press. Creak, squelch, thud. The roller passes over the plate with thousands of pounds of pressure, forcing the paper into the grooves to drink up the ink. The sheet is peeled off. It is wet and fragile. It is hung on a drying rack like laundry in the warm air of the print shop. But the stamp is not yet complete. It lacks the magic ingredient, the gum. In 1847, the adhesive on the back of a stamp was a matter of chemistry and cooking. The gumming room smelled of starch and sweetness. The mixture was typically made from dextrin, roasted starch, gum arabic, sap from the acacia tree, and a little bit of sugar or molasses to make it flexible. The gum was applied by hand with wide brushes. Workers, often women, stood at long tables, painting the backs of the dried sheets with the sticky amber-colored liquid. The sheets were then dried again. The gum crackled as it hardened. It was not the smooth, invisible adhesive we know today. It was thick, sometimes uneven, and prone to curling the paper in humid weather. On July 1, 1847, the stamps were officially released. The first shipment went to New York City Post Office. It was a humid Thursday. We can imagine the Postmaster of New York, Robert Morris, opening the wooden crate. Inside were sheets of paper, 100 stamps to a sheet. But there is a detail about these early stamps that is often forgotten, and it is a detail that defines the user experience of 1847. There were no perforations. The machine that punches little holes between stamps to make them easy to tear apart would not be used in the U.S. until 1857. The stamps of 1847 were imperforated. They were just a solid sheet of printed images. To sell a stamp, the post clerk had to take a pair of scissors, long steel shears, and physically cut the stamp from the sheet. Snip, snip, snip. The edges of an 1847 stamp were rarely straight. If the clerk was in a hurry, he might cut into the design. If he was careful, he left a wide margin of white paper. Today, collectors obsess over these margins. A stamp with wide, even margins on all 4 sides is a gem. A stamp cut crookedly is a reminder of a busy clerk in a dim room 170 years ago. For the customer, the experience of using a stamp was a novelty. Imagine a lawyer in Boston in August of 1847. He has written a letter. He goes to the post office and buys a sheet of 5-cent Franklins. He takes them back to his desk. He pulls out his own small scissors or a penknife and cuts a square of brown paper. He turns it over. He licks the gum. The taste is bland, starchy, perhaps slightly sweet from the molasses. He presses it on the upper right corner of his folded letter. He holds it there for a moment, letting the warmth of his thumb melt the gum into the fibers of the paper. The letter is now prepaid. He does not need to find the recipient to ask for money. He does not need to worry about the letter being refused. The transaction is complete before the journey begins. However, the adoption of stamps was not immediate. It was a slow, creeping change. In 1847, the use of stamps was optional. You could still send a letter, collect, if you wanted to. Old habits die hard. Many Americans were suspicious of this new system. Why pay for a service that hasn't happened yet? What if the letter gets lost? If I pay 5 cents now and the rider drops the bag in a river, I have lost my money. So, for several years, the ledger books in the post offices remained a mix of paid, with stamps, and due, without stamps.
The postmasters, however, loved the stamps. It reduced their bookkeeping. Instead of writing "paid 5" in ink on every letter, they just sold the stamps and counted the cash. To encourage the use of stamps, the Post Office Department began a campaign of gentle persuasion. But with the stamp came the need to kill the stamp. If a stamp is a form of currency, it must only be used once. If the lawyer's letter arrives in Albany and the stamp looks pristine, the recipient might steam it off and use it again. The post office could not allow this. Thus, the cancellation was born. In 1847, there were no standardized cancellation machines. The cancellation was an act of manual destruction. The postmaster at the sending office had to deface the image of Franklin or Washington so it could not be reused. Often they used a pen. They would simply draw a large X in black ink across the face of the stamp. This is known as a pen cancel or a manuscript cancel. It was a personal, aggressive mark. Some post offices carved their own cork stamps. A postmaster might take a bottle cork, carve a grid or a star pattern into the end, dip it in ink, and slam it down on the stamp. Thump! The stamp was dead, the letter was live. The town postmark, a circular stamp with the name of the city and the date, was usually applied to the envelope, not the stamp itself, though sometimes it hit both. The variety of these early cancellations is hypnotic to study. Red ink in Boston, blue ink in Philadelphia, green ink in some small towns. The stamps of 1847 carry the scars of their journey. Let us return to the 10-cent Washington stamp for a moment. This stamp was intended for longer journeys, over 300 miles. This meant it was the stamp of the westward expansion. A 10-cent stamp might be affixed to a letter in Baltimore destined for a settlement in the Ohio Territory. It would travel by train, then by stagecoach, then perhaps by steamboat. The black ink of George Washington's coat would be exposed to the humidity of the river, the dust of the road, the freezing cold of the mountains. The gum on the back had to hold. It was the only thing keeping the contract valid. If the stamp fell off, the letter became due and the recipient might refuse it. The chemistry of that acacia gum was the molecular bond holding the network together. The reforms of 1847 also introduced the concept of the pane. As mentioned, the stamps were printed in sheets of 100, but the concept of buying a book of stamps didn't exist. You bought them in strips or blocks. A customer might say, "Give me $1 worth of Franklin's." The clerk would count out 20 stamps. He would cut a block of 4 rows of 5. The customer would fold this block and put it in his wallet. The paper was high quality, rag content paper, strong and fibrous, so it could withstand being folded and carried in a pocket for weeks. There is a tactile beauty to the imperforate era. When you look at an envelope from 1848, you can see the human error. You can see where the scissors slipped and nicked the oval frame. You can see where the gum was applied too thickly and stained the paper. You can see the fingerprint of the postmaster in the ink of the cancellation. It was a handmade system at an industrial scale. The 1847 issue was in circulation for only 4 years. In 1851, the rates were lowered again to 3 cents, and a new set of stamps was designed. The 5-cent Franklin and 10-cent Washington were demonetized, declared invalid. The plates were put away. But those 4 years changed the psychology of American communication forever. Before 1847, sending a letter was a financial negotiation. After 1847, it became a transaction of trust in a product. The stamp was a receipt, a promise, and a form of currency all in one. It also democratized the mail. By shifting to sender pays, the social pressure was removed from the recipient. You could send a letter to anyone, a politician, a business, a lover, without forcing them to pay for the privilege of reading it. It greased the wheels of commerce and courtship. The aesthetic legacy of the 1847 issue is profound. The layout, portrait in the center, value at the bottom, and country name at the top became the standard template for American stamps for the next century. Franklin and Washington would appear on hundreds of different stamps, but the 1847 design remains the classic, the genesis of American philately. As we visualize the millions of letters traveling across the country in the late 1840s, we must now imagine them with these little colorful rectangles in the corner. The brown spot of Franklin, the black spot of Washington. They were like little flags. They signified that the letter had a right to be there. They signified that the sender had done their duty. In the dim light of a post office in 1849, a clerk picks up a letter.
He sees the brown Franklin stamp. He sees the X of the pen cancellation. He does not need to check a ledger. He does not need to do math. He simply throws the letter into the sorted bag. The friction is gone. The system is moving faster. The silence of the sorting room is broken only by the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the cancellation stamp. The postage stamp had arrived. A tiny square of paper, less than an inch tall, had solved a problem that spanned a continent. It was a triumph of engraving, a triumph of chemistry, and a triumph of bureaucracy. And it all started with a piece of steel, a steady hand, and a pot of brown ink in a workshop in New York City.